Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. We'll be starting shortly. Good to have everyone here. To share my screen. Hopefully you can see the PowerPoint. Yeah. Okay. So welcome everyone. Welcome to the new year. We didn't have a webinar in January, so we're starting afresh this year. We've got a really great topic, so I'm going to try to keep it brief so I can give our guests time to delve in, as I'm sure that's what most of you want. So as usual, we start from reflection of the Quran. We have talked about this verse before in terms of gender identity. So this is chapter 3 in the Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about the birth of Mary. So over here he says the wife of Imran was obviously Mary's mom. She says, so when she gave birth to her, she said, indeed, I have given birth to her, a female. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, wa Allah alama bima wada'at wa laysa zakara kal unsa. And Allah knows better what he has created or delivered, and the male is not like a female. And the verse continues, and I've named her Mary, and so on. So in terms of sex, where we have this idea of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knowing what he has created, what he has put in terms of, obviously this is in terms of sex. This other verses in chapter 4, we are looking at verses 117. So this is people who don't call God female. So it says they call upon, instead of him, females. So they're using her instead of him when they're addressing God. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says they call nothing but a divine Satan when they're using the wrong pronoun when doing that. The verse continues in verse 119. This is Satan speaking, and I will most surely lead them astray and fill them with fancies, and I will mostly command them to slit the ears of the cattle. What that means is, in the paganistic times, they used to slit the ear of the cattle to denote that this was the cattle that they would worship. So they would change the, if you like, the appearance of the cattle to distinguish that. And then Satan continues to say, surely I will command them to alter, to change what God has created. And this verse is often used for when people want to, not just the issue that we're discussing today, but people who want to perhaps change how things have been created, or they want to change it and so on. There's a similar verse in chapter 30, where in this verse, God is saying, set your face towards the upright faith. So fitra is the original disposition, the way, the primordial way that God has created us, the original disposition from Allah, which he originated mankind. Fatara nas, created mankind. And then he says there cannot be any change in God's creation. La tabdilul khalq lil khalqillah. So there is no change in how God has intended for creation to be, for example. And again, we're talking about sex in this. And there isn't, well, obviously people have issues, as we discussed gender distress, but there isn't a term of God creating something that he doesn't know that he's created in a certain way. So verses of the Quran, as we start, just a few updates. So most of you would be in our mailing list. We have, it's the start of the year, as I said, so we've sent a feedback form. I think we've not had as much participation as we wanted. So I'm giving a bit of a treat for a £10 Amazon gift voucher for people who do complete that and complete it well. The form only takes like maximum 2 minutes, I would say. And it really helps us in terms of getting feedback, in terms of what we can improve. Even if you don't want to fill in the form, you just want to send me an email, give me feedback, we would really, really appreciate that. So I'm asking for feedback. So, hopefully we can improve that. We're still seeking leads for 2 of our circles. So it's the gender identity circle and the spouse circle. So we're still looking for volunteers who can come in to help us lead those circles. In terms of other circles, our men's circles is packed in Thursday. We can't take more people. So the Sunday circle is still free for that. There's still opportunities on the Sunday Arabic circle and the women's circle for people who are interested in that. So moving on to kind of our discussion of the day. So for you in the UK would be aware that in response to an online safety bill, there was discussion of including the term conversion practices in the online safety bill. So the government then responded to saying that they won't include the term conversion practices in the online safety bill, and the Secretary of State for Culture, as I quote, writes that this is a complex area. They're looking at pre-legislative scrutiny to make sure that all stakeholders have kind of stake into this. And then they clarify the legislation must not, through a lack of clarity, harm the growing number of children and young adults experiencing gender-related distress through inadvertently criminalizing or chilling legitimate conversations parents or clinicians may have with children. And I think this is a really good statement by the government in terms of concerns that people do have in terms of therapy or explorative therapy is mentioned. Now, we have consulted, and as people know, that we have put forward our own definition of what we understand by conversion practices, where a practitioner coerces an individual to change or suppress their identity without their consent and causing harm. And I think most people will agree to that definition. Where something is done in coercion, it's done without consent. I think there's a lot of consensus to be gained in that. So let's see what they come back with, and how to move forward. The statement is available on our website. So we didn't have anything in January, but we've kind of made up. So in next month, we will have 2 webinars, if you say, to kind of make up for that. So we will have Christopher Doyle, who's joining us at the start of March, and we'll be looking at internal family systems. This is for parents. It's targeted at parents, but it could be anybody who's interested in family systems, and so on. And then we have Dr. Nicolosi Jr. joining towards the end of March to hopefully talk about exploring opposite sex attractions, what that means, perhaps giving an insight into his reintegrative therapy method and a little bit detail of what that is about. So that's coming up for March. So finally, I'm very, very pleased that Andre's taken this time to be with us, and most of you already know who he is, but I'm gonna give an introduction anyway for people who might be joining and who aren't aware of his work. So André is a board certified family physician working full-time in California. He co-chairs the American College of Pediatricians Committee on Adolescent Sexuality and the CMDA, which is the Christian Medical and Dental Association. He also writes for the CMDA on issues of bioethical and Christian concern, and has had a lot of publications. He's also involved with the Alliance Defending Freedom, which works in policy around these matters on sexual or gender identity. He has been involved in court in federal appellate for SCOTUS cases. Similarly, he advises legislators, government agencies, advocacy organizations internationally on sexuality and gender identity. He's also on the board of Bethel Church in Reading, and involved in Moral Revolution. His wife, Evelyn, both of them are former US naval officers, and he has 2 sons and 2 daughters, and the latter of are among a total of 9 foster children, which is truly amazing. So I'd like to introduce André and say thank you so much for joining and taking the time. I know it's quite early there.
Not too bad.
Yeah. So there's been so much, and I think we've been discussing in terms of there's been quite a lot of conversation around gender identity in the past 5 years or so on. And this concept hasn't, it is something, at least we see from the NHS in the UK, that there has been a growth of confusion among teens. It seems especially among female teens who are growing up, who are confused about gender. Now, we also have this legislation of conversion practices, which really came from sexual orientation. The term conversion therapy was really coined by more understanding of sexual orientation change efforts. But now, since there's this concept of LGBT as a whole, we see gender identity also being included in terms of conversion practices and so on. So it wasn't something that was maybe thought of conversion therapy in this way maybe 5 years ago, probably thought about now. So there's a very recent change in how we are seeing sex and gender, and then how that is affecting legislation. So yeah, just wanted to start with that in terms of if you think this is something quite recent, or if you think this is something that actually, gender identity has been there for a while.
Yeah, I think it's there's nothing new under the sun. I keep going back to that. And human problems have been human problems going back to ancient times. And we see the example of pagan cultures where you had, for example, the cross-dressing and whatnot, temple prostitutes. No, that's not a very nice topic, but that's just one form of demonstrating that it's been there a long time. It's just now it's being driven by forces, ideological and profiteering, because there's companies and people that stand to make a lot of money off of this. And you're right, it's just become quite this massive social contagion now, driven by media. The education system's a prime driver, legislators, etc. So there's really a lot to push against, but we're fighting the good fight here.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think you mentioned it is it's almost like a social contagion. So people who, we are seeing the both sides, people who have had gender identity distress for a while, saying that, oh, this is suddenly now in the news. It wasn't in the news in this way. We've always had people who struggled with their gender identity, and that, but not in this form where perhaps it's popularized. I think there's a difference between somebody who's actually legitimately struggling with their gender, and they are looking for unbiased support of how to deal with that distress. And then there's a part of people who are coming out as detransitioners, and they're telling their story of saying that actually they've seen it, as you said, as a social contagion, and it was something which is popular, and that they were confused, because obviously going through puberty, going through that time is a confusing time in terms of who I am, in terms of my gender identity, and a lot of people saying that, especially youth who are under 18 or under 16, taking very definite stances on who they are. So I want to refer back to you, and kind of like, are you seeing something similar in terms of in the States, in terms of this social contagion? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very much. Where the United States is a prime driver of this, because a lot of the ideological groups and corporations involved are from here. And again, with the education system, media, entertainment, all this kind of bowing allegiance to it, it's just seemingly everywhere. Also, people feel they have their hands and their mouths tied. I've said this when I was testifying, in a state legislature, when one of the state senators, supporting the other side, was kind of coming after me. And I said, this is exactly why you don't have more professionals, mental health professionals, more physicians, whatnot, coming to testify, as we have the very legitimate fear of losing our jobs, our careers, our personal safety, and potentially that of our families, just by coming up and telling you what we know and what is. But again, that we're seeing progress. We're making progress in the courts. About half the states in the United States are pushing the other way. Florida in particular is leading the pack. And Truth in Advertising, I am contracted to help the state of Florida on their efforts, and have been for about the past year. And now with the different political parties, but what we call the Republicans here, the conservatives, having taken over the Congress, now this is going to get another look at, and more things investigated and whatnot. Plus the malpractice cases are starting here, like they did in the UK. Bell versus Tavistock was what we call a bellwether a case to really bring stuff out in the open. And we have some similar cases that are starting here. Truth in Advertising, I'm involved in one of those too. So I think this is going to change. This too shall pass. But in the meantime, there's so many lives to be protected. There's kids that they can't know any better. They're kids, and they need to be protected, and come out of this with bodies that are still intact. And so that's why we fight the good fight now, rather than just letting it work its way out in the professional literature and legislatures and stuff like that.
Yeah. So some of the opponents to this approach might say that this is a minority, and then they might use the minority stress model to say, this is a minority, it's being politicized, and it's unfair on these people, and it's not a social contagion. How would you respond to people who would say minority stress?
We have several studies out, relatively recent, showing just the opposite. Secondly, as soon as they bring up minority stress, you are dealing on ideological ground. I mean, there's numerous studies showing that, minority stress, in any way you want to define it, accounts for a very small part of the mental health stress and problems. 3 different meta-analytic studies that show it's less than 9%, not 90, not 19, 9. And the very things that you think would be, a flaming minority stress, for example, countries that are particularly negative, toward this thing, their mental health stats should be better. And countries that are particularly supportive, Scandinavia, Netherlands, whatnot, they should have really great statistics for sexual minorities, and they don't. They're every bit as bad. There's even like Professor Michael Bailey, who, well known as a researcher in the sexuality field, self-identified gay man, and he's written blistering commentaries in the peer review literature on this premature acceptance of minority stress as an explanation for things when it just hasn't earned it whatsoever. So, and you brought up the conversion therapy thing, which again, I think is a junk phrase intended as a jamming tactic to shame people so that there is no discussion rather than having one. But I can't think of anything more conversionary than the chemical sterilization and surgical mutilation of otherwise very healthy bodies for sake of a problem happening here. That's conversion. And in terms of, the needs of minority people, they're already an at-risk group. So when you take away the very counseling options that help them to cope, you're taking already at-risk sexual minorities and putting them at greater risk. And again, there's studies showing that suicidality comes down with therapy, and it goes up if you go with the whole affirmative bandwagon. So there's really a lot to be learned out there in terms of, the ideologues have done a very good job indoctrinating the politicians, the legislatures, the education system, and Hollywood in general, and that's why that. I would say false narrative gets pushed so hard. People are believing falsehoods and thinking they're doing good by it.
Yeah, and it almost seems like a lot of, you would think that it's scientifically driven, right? You would think, okay, we're using numbers, we're using data, and so on, but it doesn't seem to be the case. As you mentioned, ideology taking more of a stance rather than science or research. So I mean, at present, at least in the DSM, a gender dysphoria comes as a disorder, but obviously it may not be in the next revision because there's an ideological change in terms of, and it almost makes you question the validity of what the medical profession calls a disorder. So for example, people take counseling for a lot of issues like divorce, and divorce isn't a disorder, or family issues and so
bereavement.
on. Or bereavement, exactly, which was taken away from and is not considered a disorder. So when the activists say, okay, gender dysphoria is no longer a disorder, it sometimes takes away that it is still a source of distress for people, and people need a model which isn't just affirmative. People need a model which is client-centered, as in they want something where they can fully explore the distress and see their options. And we're not just saying, oh, this is who you are,
Right.
or because this is no longer a diagnosis, we don't see it as a distress, and neither should you. So it's almost like the ideology is whatever's in these statistical manuals is worth calling a distress, and anything which isn't in these, ICD or DSM, isn't something which needs help or support.
Yeah, beware of anybody who tells you this is the way you are when they're actually talking about how you are, or excuse me, that this is who you are as opposed to, the way you are. Those are two different things. Beware false identities. Secondly, it's something we're taught early on in education. You're never supposed to take statistics or studies at face value. Things have to be able to support themselves, and you need to look at it with a wary eye. Plus, so much of the peer review literature on this subject, and some others, is really profoundly of low quality, low to very low quality, and they keep getting away with it. Like their peer review is nothing more than a rubber stamp of like-minded ideologues, and this is being exposed too.
Mm-hmm. So, and I know you've researched gender dysphoria quite a lot. What do you think are some of the patterns or the issues, or what are some of the trends that you are seeing at present with clients who be coming with gender distress or gender dysphoria?
Yeah, the two main things to understand is that the natural course of gender dysphoria is desistance by adulthood, conservatively 85% of the time. And there's numerous studies backing that up. Secondly, is there's the overwhelming probability of underlying mental health issues, adverse childhood experiences, a much higher than normal rate of neurodevelopmental problems. And I'm talking autism spectrum disorder, things like that. And those need to be addressed first, and they don't go away, by affirmation. I mean, taking on a persona of the opposite sex doesn't change what's inside you. And, sex is down to the level of your cells. I mean, every cell that has a nucleus has a sex stamped right on it. And I realize the game here has been to separate gender from sex, but even that was an ideological push. The first time that appeared in the peer review literature in 1955 was John Money, a psychologist at Johns Hopkins, who was unceremoniously fired some years later because of bad things going on. So again, those things shouldn't be. There's this, war of the words, and language. When we're talking a certain side of the political spectrum, language is uniformly weaponized. And when we're letting advocates determine what the words will and won't be, and what they mean and don't mean, we're already operating on thin ice. We're painted into a corner. So we need to contend for words, contend for definitions. Don't be painted into a corner and have yourself defined by somebody else's definitions.
Absolutely. And as you said, words being really powerful in terms of how people are kind of addressing an identity. So kind of like transgender almost becoming like an identity, which they're saying, okay, this is who we are, and this is, and to play devil's advocate, it's okay if people are okay with that, right? So if they do identify as trans and gender, and they don't have distress with that, and they're okay as who they are, it isn't for anybody else to tell them that how they identify is wrong, or that they're pushed towards a certain narrative, if that's who they feel they are and they're happy with.
Well, a problem with that is it is being imposed on minors. And minors have absolutely no way, they don't have the maturity to see through this and to push back through this. So it's not like it's a live and let live thing. It's like, the ideologues and the corporations and the education system are coming directly for the kids. So that needs to be opposed. Secondly, to a degree, yeah, the decisions an adult makes are the decisions an adult makes, and you get to make some really bad ones. It's part of freedom. But to be forewarned is to be forearmed. And, the fact that someone doesn't have the dysphoria, but has the misassociation, doesn't necessarily align itself with good outcomes either. They have a really high rate of, suicide, mental health problems, stuff like that. And you know how mental health works. Somebody can think they're just fine, and anybody on the outside can see it's not the case. You're struggling with all kinds of stuff, but you've got it set in your mind. The problem can't be you. It must be everybody else, right? So even for someone who's going to make that decision, I don't think it's fair that they not be fully informed, the idea of informed consent of what they're walking into. There's a lot of problems that will remain with you. And the fact is that affirmation is not shown to be superior to, good mental health care and good spiritual counseling that helps you live in alignment with your body, bodily integrity, mind, body, and spirit. There's something to be said for that.
And, as you're saying, how they're targeting youth, and we are seeing a lot of like we saw the Kira Bell case, or we are seeing testimonies from across the world of youth coming forward as detransition, or they're detransitioning. And obviously it takes a lot of courage for these individuals to come forward and say, oh,
Yes.
I did this wrong. I was, I was under wrong false impression, or I was given the wrong advice. And we had the Tavistock clinic, which was shut down, and we had numerous resignations.
Right.
And a lot of whistleblowers who kind of spoke of what was kind of, a very medicalized approach to, to gender distress. How does a clinician who's working with youth today, if they're watching this, how do you navigate this? Because at one end, you want to be neutral. You don't want to be imposing your values on what the client is bringing, but at the same time, you do want to challenge them so that if you don't challenge them, they're just accepting how things are coming. How would clinicians, and I know you're a physician, when people, how do you strike that balance ethically when people come up to you and say, well, I don't know, I have this distress, I don't know whether I should go surgery, or I do this, in the case of minors?
Right. Well, and of course, clinicians, mental health people are very much under the gun, depending on what country you live in, for fear that if you say the right thing you're actually supposed to say professionally, you will run afoul of some law that will put you in harm's way. So the fear is real for a lot of people. But I've kind of broken it down to 6 main points, and basically I usually start I would advise starting by saying something like, my job, I don't make your decisions for you. My job is to give you the very best advice that I can, and the facts as best I know them, for you to make your decision. And again, if you're talking to a minor, the first thing would be to say desistance is the norm, 85% and up by adulthood. So what's the rush? The second thing is that there are decades of professional literature showing the strong likelihood of underlying issues that need to be addressed. And in fact, for nations like Sweden and Finland, and even in the case of the Netherlands and the so-called Dutch protocol, the first order of business was addressing those before anybody was allowed to go on, a pathway for gender affirmation. And of course, now those countries have done complete 180s, and it's like, you're not getting this underage at all. But number one is desistance is the norm. Number two, the strong likelihood that there's underlying problems that need to be dealt with because they're not going away. Third is explaining the short and long-term risks of gender-affirming therapy, which are substantial and sobering. Fourth is that the long-term benefits and safety of affirmation are not proven. Fifth is that regret is not rare, and this is something to consider now, not later. And again, if you're talking to a minor, the fact that brain development's not going to be complete for a quarter century, and the last part to mature, that prefrontal cortex, is the judgment and inhibition center, the very part of the brain they're needing, for this kind of a decision, and it's just not fully there for them yet. Saying those things are completely based on professional literature, on science. There's nothing ideological about them. Someone can disagree and get angry, but you can back up, what you're saying. But again, our job is to give the best information we can, and that information is just not positive for the idea of, gender-affirming medical interventions.
Yeah, and in terms of the studies, are there any studies, say twin studies, or studies which are, where they say we're born this way, so it's our genetical makeup, which is, I think they have the word two-spirit, or sometimes, in the US kind of they use we're created, or it's genetically in this way. Are there any genetic type studies which, kind of are done on transgender or this population?
Well, the first thing I'd say is the press release put out last year by the French National Academy of Medicine said they found no genetic associations with transgenderism. In terms of twin studies, depending on what you look at, that comes out saying, well, 61 to 72% of what they call monozygotic or identical twins, and nearly all dizygotic twin pairs, meaning, fraternal twins, were discordant for transsexualism. So, if you're a twin but not an identical twin, it's very rare that, both twins will identify as transsexual. And in the case of identical twins, more than 2/3 of the time, that's not the case. And so, there's a lot of reasons other than genetics for a third of identical twins, both associating as trans. I mean, they grew up in the same home, had the same parents, probably had the same problems and exposures. Secondly, if we're talking about either transgenderism or same-sex attraction, we refer to those as multifactorial adaptations. They're adaptations. You have to live a while before you adapt to anything. They're not genetic in that way. And thirdly, people just don't understand behavioral genetics. It's not at all about born that way. It's about predispositions, and predispositions are not destiny. So the problem is the public as a whole is very misinformed about behavioral genetics, and it's the media that help get them there.
Absolutely. One of the other things we've actually had queries from parents is rapid onset gender dysphoria. And then they're coming to us and they're saying, this is what I've got a diagnosis with my child, teen is showing signs of rapid onset gender dysphoria, where obviously it's not genetic, it's come about. How do you navigate something like that?
Yeah, because the problem is, with the kids that are coached by the webs or coached by their friends, particularly if they have a friend who comes out as trans, that greatly increases their chance that they start looking at their problems that way, And Dr. Lisa Littman, in her, first of its kind survey study of parents of rapid onset gender dysphoria, I think that was like 2018. And these are parents who are otherwise, what we call, fairly secular left leaning. And they said that easily 2/3 of the kids had pre-existing mental health problems that they were even, getting help for before there was any mention of, gender incongruity kind of thing. They found that the more they got into the web on this subject, the worse their mental health got. They became distrustful of family and friends that weren't pro-trans, and everything just kind of tailspun, the further it went. So there's likely to be a combination of the social contagion. Well, I have these friends, quote unquote, and the underlying, mental health problems. And again, it's no trouble being led down the wrong path if you spend enough time on the web, because everything's there just to lure kids into it and to convince them of things erroneously.
Mhm. Some people say that children are very wise these days. They know, what to do. They make other decisions in life. How would you respond to somebody who says that children can consent to, surgery?
Well, this isn't any kind of emergency surgery. This isn't an appendix that's going to burst or anything like that. This is all altering what's otherwise a perfectly normal and healthy body. And I realize in the UK there's this question of Gillett consent, whatever, that's now coming up under review. I've spoken to an Australian professor who's in the process of writing a paper for peer review that's going to show Gillett consent doesn't hold up, to the scientific literature and stuff. Excuse me. We don't let kids drink underage precisely because of how bad the decisions are. And that's just drinking. They can't sign up to join the military, under a certain age. They can't sign contracts, contract law, or that kind of thing under a certain age because they're not up to it. So again, we're not talking, transfusions for someone who's bleeding to death, the appendix that's about to rupture, this kind of thing, where it's a life and death issue. We're talking about things that you have all kinds of time, to think this through and to get other problems dealt with. What you do as an adult is on you, for good or for bad. But again, by the time they reach adulthood, more than 85% of these kids will be at peace with their physical bodies and not, seeking the trans answer anymore.
Mm-hmm. So we've discussed quite a lot about minors with gender dysphoria, gender distress. So if we have adults who come and they want help, they want to see how possibly they can address their distress. What is the support? What is the pathway for that?
Yeah, well, my first principle here would be there's always a more honest answer than gender affirming medical interventions. They may be painful. We're asking people to face their pain and their problems. And obviously, people would prefer to avoid, that. But getting good, competent, psychological help, support is very important. If you can get good, competent spiritual help, also, very important. The problem is you've got mental health experts that are terrified to provide that for fear they'll be brought up on charges and lose their license and their careers. So there's some protection that needs to be afforded, the professionals in this too, if we're expecting people to get what they really need.
So, and you work in this environment. Do you sense there's a fear of clinicians among clinicians who are afraid to do the right thing and come forward for this population? You work with the American College of Pediatricians, and obviously, they've taken very brave stance to say, actually, this is unethical, it's unscientific. Do you think people are generally just afraid to rock the boat?
I think that's very true. I mean, those of us that rock the boat, we're not drowning in company. But yeah, even the companies you work for, will be reminding you their diversity, equity, and inclusion divisions, which of course are anything but diverse, equitable, and inclusive. Otherwise, they'd be, protecting the rights and the views of people who oppose, this currently favored group. So yeah, there's intimidation out there. There's fear. It's not that there's no one doing the right thing, but man, the activist will, if they view you as a big enough threat, they'll just lock right onto you and make life miserable and, be writing your employer and trying to cause trouble. So, yeah, but, this is not new. I mean, fighting bad, harmful things in culture, this is how it is. It's a minority of people who do it. Everybody says, oh, if I'd been alive back there and I would have been, on the side of right and truth. But, oh, really? Show me where you're doing that now, knowing the cost, knowing that you'll be rejected by the elites, knowing that it could affect your opportunities for education and for good employment and stuff. So again, I think it's always been this way. This is what it is to fight harm in culture.
You mentioned the desistance model. Do you think it's harder for clinicians to use the desistance model, and it might be easier to just affirm whatever someone's coming with and say, yeah, I'll do it for you, rather than having the medical ethics and kind of state that that there is a chance for desistance, and like we say, watchful waiting.
It's getting easier to take that position. I mean, the fight is on. Again, the changes in the UK, Sweden, Finland, that all involve, comprehensive literature reviews. The state of Florida, the fourth one to have a comprehensive literature review on this, and to show, the support for this gender affirming medical intervention model is simply not there. And in fact, it's not shown to be safe or effective. This actually probably harms. So it's getting easier, to do the right thing. I mean, the other side has brought out all their big guns, the big organizations, whatever, the way they're opposing stuff in Florida. But that just gives us the opportunity to expose their materials in court, which that's what's happening. So you're on very solid academic ground with the idea of desistance by adulthood. There's also desistance in adulthood. And I know some people don't like hearing that, but that's where, regret comes from. And the best studies that actually bothered to look long-term, not this ridiculous 6-month, 1-year, 2-year follow-up where you use a self-survey, like how satisfied are you with your used car kind of thing, but where you actually follow, 9, 10 years out and more, you see the suicide rate is catastrophic. The 2011 study out of Sweden followed 10 years out. The completed suicide rate was 19 times that of the general population, 3 times the all-cause mortality, meaning all the things that kill somebody, and nearly 3 times the psychiatric hospitalization rate. Brandstrom and Pachankis, that came online 2019, published 2020, literature review electronically of the entire Swedish population. It ultimately showed neither gender-affirming hormones nor gender-affirming surgery improved any of the healthcare markers they were looking for. Again, this isn't the answer, I don't think. If someone chooses it, there's not much I can do about that. They live their own life. But even then, if I'm going to be forced to comply with that, now I have a problem. I'm not going to be the source of them getting it. I'm not going to be the source of the referral, because the referral would make me complicit in what I think is unethical, ineffective, immoral, bad medicine. And that's also a point where the legal lines are being fought at this point too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems, especially for doctors, and that it's almost as if you're withholding the information from the client in terms of what these studies are, what the research is actually showing. And, the affirmative model almost isn't looking at critique, so we know in medicine, any treatment is open for critique, for new research, for, kind of people to have a different point of view or different perspective. And obviously it's always up to the client, who is then informed, to make the decision. And once they have been informed, it's adequate. And so many cases that we're seeing that these people just haven't been informed. They haven't been informed of desistance. They haven't been informed of the complexities after the surgery and what, and, some of them, like we saw in the NHS, were almost told it's reversible, or, it isn't, that, oh, these hormones are reversible, there's nothing wrong. And actually that there was no credibility for that. So it's almost as if you're not practicing ethically with that. You're not telling the client the full story and the full information. It almost seems like the approach where you are being client-centered or being, with the patient's best concern is mine, is is considered wrong, or it's considered that, oh, you can't tell them about research, or so it's
Right.
so it's like you said, it's ideological, which is crazy, because medicine's supposed to be run by science, it's supposed to
Yeah.
be run by research. And it's not even as if, like you're saying, the affirmative care is showing research which is contradicting the other research. We're not at that point. The research is saying, and it has been for a number of years, as if you said, that this isn't a new issue within medicine.
Yeah. And you touched on something earlier about, people saying, well, you're being discriminatory against us. And actually, I would submit to you, this is non-discriminatory. Refusing to provide, transition affirming healthcare is actually non-discriminatory and appropriate professionally and scientifically. I mean, it's not proven safe, not proven effective, or to be of more benefit. There's this, raft of scientific international pushback from Northern Europe and England, as I spoke of. As a physician, I take an oath to do no harm, and this gender affirming approach leads to much harm and no proof of compensatory benefit that would outweigh the harm. Withholding an unproven intervention is non-discriminatory. Again, we have no way of knowing who exactly is going to desist or persist. So what's the rush, of affirming that? And there's alternative treatments available. It's not like there's, nothing aside from affirmation, mental health, which, again, are shown to be at least as effective as hormones and surgery without any of those complications that come with it. So I would submit that the mental health approach and waiting is in fact non-discriminatory.
Do you think, like, before this ideological change, that the clients who were coming with gender distress were allowed mental health options, which, and once that happened, then they had all the information that was available for them to make that decision, knowing the harms, knowing the issues, and they're fully informed. Do you think that was happening before and it's not happening now, and there's been a change in how the treatment or the guidance is now, that it's changed?
Yeah, this whole thing of the hormones and the surgery started with kids, in the 90s and early 2000s with the Dutch protocol, which again quickly morphed. I mean, it's like a lot of these things that are sold that looks very restrictive on the outside, but then you get on the inside and you find it's kind of squishy. But what's been done in the United States, which the UK's interim CAS report specified, they said the affirmative model is an American thing. That's where it comes from, not the Dutch, in which case, what age limits? It's just like, affirmation on demand in whatever stage that comes in. Now, the other, thing for people to know is quite often when someone, comes into your office looking, to transition, any kind of pushback, you may never see them again. I mean, they're looking for a rubber stamp. So, but the people I know that have worked with this population the longest say, the trick is to ask the right, open-ended questions and realize it will not be a single discussion. like Walt Heyer says, it's going to be 5 to 10, and the discussion stops when the patient says it stops. You try to push past that, it's just not going to go well. But if you can, get that trust relationship with them and continue the conversation, then they're more likely to start to open up. And, you're looking for things like, well, was there a certain day where something happened that just, you made the decision then that you were tired of being who you are, or you weren't happy with your sex? And what you're looking for is those underlying traumas, adverse childhood experiences, something other mental health going on. But it's the idea of trying to open things up with the client, with the patient, as opposed to just being a wall that they bounce off of. But again, they are very likely to fly the coop when they see you're not going to provide what they want. But you should still, stand your ground as a professional or stand your ground as a friend. Boldness doesn't mean you're being nasty or belligerent or mean. Sometimes boldness is saying nothing except what you just said. I'm very sorry you feel that way, or whatever. But yeah, that's the deal. So the Dutch protocol, by the way, there's a recent paper by Professor Biggs coming out of Oxford, and an American team, Levine, I don't know how to pronounce the name, Abruzzi, it's a very long name, and Mason, that the two together decimate the Dutch protocol and the history of how it got here. Two very good studies, or I should say commentary papers to be familiar with. But what's going on now, I think, a lot of it is our fault here in America.
I mean, there have been people who have transitioned, done the surgery, and then they said they are still in gender distress,
Yes.
So you have these voices who have gone the full procedure, and they're saying that they still have, that it isn't brought about what they think it was going to bring about, because there's still that, that there's still that inner conflict, which is still there.
Right.
Now, with and we have that, we've had people come up to us with that, saying, okay, I've gone through it, it's not what I thought it was going to be, and kind of so on. Kind of, we talk about success rates in desistance, right? So it's very interesting that we don't really talk about success rates in affirmative care in terms of, if we were to look at that model objectively and say, okay, how many people benefited? Let's look at it, scientifically, objectively, how many people are really saying that actually my gender dysphoria, my distress has been alleviated through the surgery, because that's what it's almost popularized, that
Right.
the surgery is going to diminish the distress.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the before and after comparisons here and how rare those are. And Johns Hopkins University, back in the 60s, 70s, was, a leader in the nation in its sex reassignment surgery clinic. Well, Professor Paul McHugh eventually took over the psychiatry department there, and the sex change clinic was subordinate to that. So the first thing he did is he tasked the people there. He goes, all those psychometric tests you give to people leading up to the sex reassignment surgery, repeat them afterwards. And they did, and they found that nothing improved. Even if the person said, oh, I feel better, it's like the depression was still there, the bipolar was still there, the whatever personality disorder was still there, whatever problems they had before were all still there. And that's what led to the closing down of that clinic. And then in short order, all of them in the United States. I mean, 2007, there was one in the US. And 2019, there's 65. And that doesn't even explain for them all, because Planned Parenthood, which is like Marie Snopes, I think is the one you have in the UK, Planned Parenthood clinics offer hormones now, and they're not competent to do it. And there's lots of Planned Parenthood clinics. So, and it's not like someone has to go to a university gender clinic or go to Planned Parenthood, you can get hormones on the web. I mean, the controls just aren't there. There's a lot of ways to get hurt.
So you're saying that these hormones are now readily available. They're not even, prescription based. You're saying they're
A kid can pick them up on the web. Again, it shouldn't be. That's technically illegal. And yet, they're there. I mean, when they get found out, and addressed, they get shut down. But not all of them. It's just, in the age of the internet and the web, it's just regrettably too easy to do.
Absolutely. We'll be starting Q&A in a bit. Was there any points you want to go further on in terms of?
I provided Ali my general lecture notes on this. Don't be intimidated by it, but it's 72 pages with 350 references. But there's a very nice table of contents on page 1 that shows you all the different sections. Makes it very easy for you to navigate, I would hope, especially certain areas that are of greater interest to you. The midsection is called the bullet points, and they are just that, the things I like to review before I'm going to have an interview in the media or something like that. And it's a relatively quick way to go through it. And I've repeated a lot of the citations, as footnotes there, if that's of interest to you. But there's a great deal there. It represents like 6 years of my work, so hopeful it will be of use to you.
I can certainly vouch for that. I've had a quick read of it, and it has brilliant references to all that's there. It's highly referenced, and of course we will make it available for people to have a look. And there's just reading through it, it's the research is enormous, right? There's an enormous research on what we are saying, and it's not it almost sometimes feels like that, like people who have this approach have an ideology, and it's an ideology versus an ideology, and it's not. And it's, like if there were cases of research which was saying, no, this is the best way, right? You'd entertain that, and you would say, okay. And that's how science works, right? Because you find something that actually this is, but there isn't, and there's an overwhelming research and years of research which has been done with gender dysphoria, which is kind of like completely being cast aside and not being looked at for social contagion, or for people just wanting to do something and kind of not having the right information. So we will definitely provide the lecture notes. So I want to open up for Q&A. Just be aware that you can raise your hand and you can ask, but be aware your name will be shown. So if you want to stay anonymous, you can use the Q&A function, you can use the anonymous function, and kind of so on for that. While people are doing Q&A, I have a question in terms of it doesn't seem in the US that the public opinion is for gender affirmative care,
That's
so right. We're seeing a lot of I think Trump recently, he kind of had the statement where he's saying, this is my stance, I'm not allowing any of it. You have I think Matt Walsh, who came up with this documentary, which is, kind of what is a woman and that. So, and it does seem like there's a huge majority, or the public majority in the US doesn't seem to be agreeing with, there doesn't seem to be this type of consensus. And how is it that it is so popularized, or it's become so prevalent, when it doesn't seem that it does have that, because with other things you can argue that, okay, in the past, society used to view things this way. We don't view things now. But in terms of gender identity, it is still a concept which is relatively new for people to kind of understand.
Yeah, so people get emotionally blackmailed. In the case of the parents of these kids as well. Do you want to be planning a transition or a funeral? Do you want a live son or a dead daughter? Which is, of course, completely fallacious. Gender affirming therapy can't deliver on those things. But for those directly involved, there's that kind of intimidation. For people in general, again, when the ideological groups are controlling your employer and the rules where you work, the university where you attend, the schools where you attend, that coerces people into silence. But I think you're right. The majority of Americans don't think this is a good thing. I think of something the Reverend Dr. Billy Graham said a long time ago. When one person stands up, other people's spines can straighten. So once they see the example that there are people pushing back, there's ways to oppose this, courage starts to rise. But what do you do when the academic system, media, entertainment, corporations and whatnot have just, as we say, all gone south on this thing? It makes it pretty difficult for people.
Absolutely. And I think with, especially in the UK, when we've had the Tavistock case, we've had other cases where people have been discriminated for their view that sex is binary, for example, and then they have won that in courts. Is it being a belief which is protected? You are seeing that it's kind of when one person starts and they're like, oh yes, I was like, the famous line that the majority is silent.
Right.
on thing until someone speaks and says, actually, this doesn't seem quite right. We have a question. So the question is saying, you mentioned the concept of children not quite ready to make those decisions at that age. So, and you mentioned like the I think it put brain not ready at that time. When would you think that people are ready? Like, when is the brain ready to kind of make that type of decision?
That prefrontal cortex is generally fully formed at about a quarter century point, 23 to 25. But the framework, of laws globally, adulthood tends to hit around 18, which is to say, at 18, in the eyes of the law, you're ready to decide most of whatever, even though it's not altogether true. There's people that, view other things, about this because of that reality that, sexuality issues aside, maybe people need to be a little older before, whatever, but it's not the way the world has come down, on the subject and stuff. So not before 18, I'm agreeing with the nations and the states that have come down saying this is not a decision a minor can make. And, we even have a group of trans-identified adults who work with us on these projects who are fully in agreement that, yep, there's no way a minor has the wherewithal, in their words, mind you, they do not have the wherewithal mentally, physically, or spiritually to make this decision and what goes with it. But from the profiteering point of view, the other way around, you look at the DSM-5 and the rate, of this stuff should be maximally 15/1000% for males, natal males, and gender dysphoria maximally 3/1000% for natal females. But now we have like 5 different surveys, I think, in the US showing that either in certain states or nationally, upwards of 2% of minors say, oh, I might be trans. Well, that represents a 1,000-fold increase in market share. If someone's part of a company that's selling the hormones, the puberty blockers, that does the surgeries, or a biotech firm that provides some kind of widget to make someone, present more like the opposite sex, profit 1,000 times more than they would have had before. And once someone's medicalized, you're medicalized for the rest of your life. You're always going to need those cross-sex, wrong-sex hormones. If you do engage in surgeries, they lead to more because they have complications. Or if you're compulsive about it and you think, oh, the next surgery is going to be the answer for me, and it won't be any more than the last surgery was. These people are medicalized for the rest of their lives. And now we have several reports coming out, even when they're talking about gender affirming interventions, they're saying there remains a lifetime need for mental health support. Maybe you should start with the mental health support and stay there and keep your body intact and do just as well.
Exactly. And I think sometimes we live in a world of quick medicine, right? And we don't want to have cases which are going to take long, or tell the client, actually, this is like even in my own case where I had sexual identity issues, it was like, okay, I didn't want to be told that this is a lifetime issue. This is going to be something I'm going to have for lifetime. But that was the honest truth. And I would have preferred if at the start somebody told me that, because then,
Right.
I set my expectation right. And it isn't something that people want to hear, but it is the truth that something, and for, a lot of gender being something which is so innate to our identity, we can't even probably, I don't know, pinpoint when we have the difference of, oh, I'm, what my gender, what my sex is. And that is so innate in our very early development. So when that is challenged and we don't have a certainty, it's not like I'm going to take a pill or I'm going to do a surgical procedure and it's just going to resolve that. Even someone who's like me, a layman who kind of looks at it that way, you cannot possibly think that a procedure or even a counseling session or a year of that is just going to eradicate the gender distress somehow. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, fast food, microwave society, fast answers, that's what people expect. But, a take home on that too is that there's many ways to be a man and you're still a man. And there's many ways to be a woman and you're still a woman. So, having this trait or this like that looks more like what guys do means you're a woman who likes this one thing guys like, and vice versa. It doesn't have other implications, there's no hidden Gnostic identity that supersedes your physical body, and I think if you're looking to put an ideological tag of religion on this thing, it's Gnosticism. It's modern day Gnosticism. And again, that would be another example of there's nothing new under the sun. This was there before,
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Let's see, what are questions? This question on, do you think neuroplasticity has an effect in gender dysphoria? So I'm guessing that's kind of looking at perhaps what you mean by desistance, right? So the brain kind of changing, or neuroplasticity.
Yeah, and there's a section on neuroplasticity in my lecture notes for you with the references and stuff there. So neuroplasticity is the idea of the brain as muscle, that the brain itself changes with experience, exposures, the decisions we make. So if it changes one way, it can also change another. That's, if you can use the brain as muscle analogy, it works both ways. And so that's also a reason why these studies, looking at MRIs and PET scans and saying, oh, trans brain or gay brain, meaningless. Neuroplasticity invalidates that. Plus, who says, this change you're seeing make someone trans, or the other. It's like, again, it's a poor understanding of what's being looked at, and methodological misconceptions. So yeah, don't be swayed by those kind of studies. Yeah, neuroplasticity works both ways,
Mhm. Let me see if there's more. In terms of what you see for the future, so at least what we're seeing in the UK, as you mentioned with the CAST report, they've had an interim report, and they have suggested, as you suggested in your lecture, in terms of language. So if you do promote language, which includes pronouns and so on at a young age, that can, and this is the NHS, which is saying that can have an adverse effect, because you're already putting that identity, you're affirming that identity on, on the children. And the CAST reviews kind of, the interim report is raising questions on the affirmative model, as you just said, to say that there is an evidence to say that is the best way, that is the best approach to take. And like you said, it says in the glossary, it's originated from the States, so on. How would you see a competent gender identity clinic? We have the issue that we now have a huge amount of population of teens, which we didn't have before, which are now presenting gender dysphoria due to a variety of reasons. How best can, say with the NHS, or how best do clinicians take this? And I think even I say myself, we have had an increase. So even with strong support, when we started for sexual identity, but I quickly emerged, there wasn't any support for people who were having gender identity distress. And in terms of providing support, or people who are leaders, people who are watching this, who are concerned, how do we support, this population? Because we have to admit that it is something which is a concern now. Perhaps it wasn't a concern earlier. We have a huge population, parents who are coming towards this.
Yeah.
How do we start and kind of help this from an individual standpoint, but also from our healthcare systems?
Yeah, man, that's a lot of questions rolled into one. The very last part of my lecture notes is under the heading guidance. And at the very end of it, there are links to different helpful groups, helpful information, whatever, to kind of get started on different things. So that's great. The CAST review and subsequent stuff out of the NHS proposals for, okay, well, in accordance with the CAST review, here's how we want, the GID centers to look like when they come back after having closed down what was the world's largest pediatric gender clinic. And as you were saying, one of the things they stated was emphasis on the fact of desistance. New emphasis on the fact that social transition, social affirmation is itself an intervention, and not without effect. It's not benign. As you were alluding to earlier, as soon as you start, switching pronouns on a kid, social transition is literature proven to derail natural desistance in the direction of persistence. And why wouldn't it? You're reinforcing this child's false conceptions. When all the authority figures in a kid's life are saying, yep, you were born in the wrong body, a kid's going to tend to believe it. So you don't want to you don't want to condemn the person, obviously, but you also don't want to reinforce non-reality. Again, the mental health support, the spiritual support, finding where people are, what their issues are, helping them to discuss and investigate that. Just knowing that they're accepted, that they don't have to do things to get our acceptance and our love and appreciation. That's important too. For this, the thing of parents, there's I have a section, the second to last in the lecture notes, advice from the pros. Different, for example, psychiatrists involved in this, or people that have involved. Well, in the case of Waltire, he did the full transition and lived as a woman for 13 years and then came out of it. And for the past, 30 plus years, 40 years, has been helping other people get out of it. And he has all kinds of advice, for parents and professionals. And, I have those listed there in terms of, how the question and answer should proceed, what you're looking for, these, broad questions that allow somebody to talk rather than feeling like they have to defend themselves, which, they'll do in a minute if they're made to feel defensive. But we need to be having the conversations. We can't trust the schools to do it. They're part of the problem. You can't trust the legislature, and for sure, you need to know what your kids are watching on TV, what they're watching on the web. They won't like that you're looking over their shoulder, but it's your job as a parent. And there's lots and lots of really bad stuff on the web. There's no bottom to bad stuff people can do. You know what I mean? So you really, it's a rescue operation here, but that's part of it as well.
Absolutely. I think you mentioned encouraging that there's many ways to be a man, or there's many ways to be a woman, where parents can break the stereotypes that exist in society of what a male needs to be or what a female needs to be. And we live in a very materialistic, image-based society, which says, which concentrates on perhaps the image of what a man is or image of what a woman is, but doesn't actually maybe see the qualities or the inherent personality or the nature and how there is a diversity in masculinity and there is a diversity in femininity, and that is that's to be appreciated, that we have masculinity and femininity within all of us and in some ranges of that degree. And it doesn't mean that there's this very small box of what masculinity or femininity is, and if we're not in this small box, then we need to identify as something else. So it almost seems like you say, the social conditioning has been such that if if I'm a boy and I'm playing with dolls, and it means that, maybe something's not right, or kind of these type of stereotypes, which almost now are being compared to I'm existentially something different, rather than appreciating the diversity of what it is to be, I would say, what is to be human in a sense. It's arguably we have a humanness within us, and our just if we transition by surgery to another, we change our bodies, it's not going to change the mind, it's not going to change who we are, who our self, our perception of self is. So it almost seems like because we're a society which is still so focused on the body, the outer look of the body, that we think if we change the body, we will change what's inside.
Yeah, and this is a part of the reason that the stats have changed, that instead of 15, 20 years ago, and it was majority, males with the gender dysphoria. Now it's majority females. Is there's so much pressure on girls, in modern society. You got to look perfect. You got to be this. You got to be that. All this training to have this, internalized misogyny. I don't like this about myself. This isn't right. That isn't right. To the point we're looking at puberty and the fact they're going to start having menses as just overwhelming, and so you look for an escape. So girls have it pretty rough, but also, you can see why something that is largely being, driven by social contagion is going to be of higher prevalence among the girls, because the girls are more social in the first place, generally speaking. Yeah, so there's a lot going on here.
Absolutely. And I want to echo what you just said in terms of, I will put the lecture notes, and there is so much which is there in terms of advice for parents, and really good resources, like I can see the parents gender resource guide, finding therapists who deal with it, as you mentioned, Walt Hires case, sexchangeregret.com, and that there is resources which are out there. And it also seems like there is a movement, at least in UK, in terms of the therapists who are now looking at ideal ways of addressing gender dysphoria, and kind of picking this population which almost nobody wants to pick because it's so controversial to pick this population. Yes, so that there is help which is kind of out there, so you can approach therapists who are kind of not ideologically driven, and they are looking at the science, and there isn't, like we just discussed today, there isn't a very like, oh, this study says this, but this study says this. There doesn't seem to be that within this case. Any closing remarks, anything you would like to add that we've not perhaps touched upon?
Stand up, be accounted for, look after your family, look after your friends, inquire, be confident that good ethics, good medicine, good science is on your side with this, and we're going to see this turn around.
Absolutely. If people would like to know more of you, to contact you, support your work, Andre, how can they reach you? How can they support your work that you're doing?
I think at the same end of this thing is some contact information. Again, I'm a family physician in full-time practice. That's what I do. I'm a doctor, a medic, as you say in the UK. And some of these other groups that I've listed here, for them, it's a more full-time thing, also. So don't hesitate to contact them. But yeah, I think the contact stuff's at the end of the lecture there. But I thank you much for having me on today.
No, thank you so much. And as always, I will put the notes, and you can go through the 72-page document, and it's really testament for the effort, and I would say the courage. It takes people with a lot of courage to go against the tide, to say, look, this is the research, do the referencing, and kind of put effort, because I know this isn't your main job, this is your family physician. So I really want to extend thank you for the work that you are doing, and may God protect you and bless you in the work which is so important in this world will, unfortunately, it seems like people are wanting outcomes, or they're wanting a predefined outcome for children who are experiencing this distress. And yes, we continue to pray that hopefully more and more people are aware of the resources, and they're aware of what to do, and that there is help which is out there if your child, or you yourself, if you're watching this, is affecting you. So thank you so much for your time, Andre, and God bless.
Thanks.